He often said during his cancer illnesses that there's always hope. And he said this to me across the hospital bed one Tuesday late in October. He was being asked whether he wanted to be taken to a different hospital for treatment if he got an infection. He said, yes, there's always hope. And it was the last time he said that to me because he died the very next morning.
Welcome to Beyond the Weeds, the podcast where perseverance meets potential. I'm Josh Realm, public speaker, marathon runner, asthma advocate, and your host as we explore the intersection of health, fitness, and resilience. Whether you're managing asthma, chasing a new personal best, or simply looking for inspiration, Beyond the Weeds is here to show you that no challenge is too great to overcome. Together, we'll uncover stories, insights, and strategies to help you push beyond your limits. It's time to breathe deeply, move forward, and unlock your true potential, one step at a time.
Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Christine Fader to Beyond the Weeds. Christine is a caregiver advocate, author, speaker, and cancer widow whose journey has been marked by profound personal loss and inspiring advocacy. After her husband Michael was diagnosed with two separate cancers, first throat cancer in 2018, then a rare and aggressive large cell lung cancer in 2020, Christine's life changed dramatically. Michael's courage, resilience, and hope through his treatment and tragic passing in 2022 sparked Christine's mission to raise awareness about lung cancer, trauma-informed cancer care, and the needs of caregivers. Christine brings over 20 years of experience as a career advisor and author, and she now channels her energy into improving systems for cancer patients and families, speaking widely about trauma, grief, and advocacy. With all that being said, thanks for joining us, Christine. Welcome to Beyond the Weeds.
Thank you very much for having me.
A little bit of context for our listeners. You reached out to me recently after having seen me speak at Better Breathing Week 2025 in Toronto, put on by the Lung Health Foundation. And you had a story to share, and you knew that I had this podcast, and we chatted a little bit and thought it would be great to get you on so you could discuss your journey as a caregiver and your husband's journey as well.
Thanks for letting me spread the awareness and raise profiles of these kinds of issues. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I totally get it. And that's why I created the space, just for that. So Christine, before we dive into the details of your advocacy and workshops, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journey. Can you share with us what led you to become such a passionate voice for lung cancer awareness, trauma-informed care, and caregiver support?
So my husband, Michael, was diagnosed with his first cancer in 2018, as you mentioned. We had been married for 20 years at that point, so 25 years by the time he passed away, almost. He was diagnosed with throat cancer after having a sore throat that he said to me, it hurts right here. And he would point at a very specific spot. And as someone who got my tonsils out in my 30s, I thought that was odd, that it wasn't just sort of general throat pain. So he was checked for all kinds of things and ultimately diagnosed with early stage throat cancer in 2018, and went through 35 rounds of radiation treatment for that and was being followed for that afterwards because they didn't find any evidence of cancer left, which was great. They said to us at the time, this is a very curable cancer. You have an early stage of it. You're not going to like how we get to the cure because it affects your voice and your speaking and your eating and all kinds of things. But we are very confident we can cure this, and they seem to have. Later in 2019, he'd recovered mostly from the side effects of radiation, and we were living our lives in our country property, going on our boat. And Michael was a jack of all trades, so he was doing all kinds of things on our property, building and fixing and climbing on the roof and all things that a retired skydiver likes to do, hang off of things that are high and tall. And then in 2020, at the kind of peak of the pandemic, the early stages of it, when everybody was kind of at home and isolating, he mentioned that his rib was hurting, and he had just talked about that a couple of weeks earlier. And at that point we had thought, he just pulled a muscle or something. But when it reappeared, I thought, this is kind of very short time between the last time and this time. So I thought to him, maybe you broke a rib or cracked a rib, and maybe you should get an X-ray just to kind of make sure that there's nothing going on that we should know about. So we expected him to go to Emerge, get the X-ray, come home, and either have a cracked rib or not. But after they did the x-ray, he went by himself to emergency because it was the pandemic and I wasn't allowed to go in. So he just went by himself. And he called me and said they did the x-ray and unfortunately they found a mass in my lung. And my heart just dropped. And he said, don't worry. I don't want you to worry. They're going to do a CT scan to look at it more closely now, and I'll call you before I come home. And so I said, okay. And I hung up the phone and burst into tears. And he came home without calling me because they had come into the room after the CT and said, I'm very sorry, but you have lung cancer. And so he wanted to tell me that in person. And so that was startling to us because he was being followed already for cancer. And so it was sort of like, how did this happen, fairly close to his previous cancer and nobody knew that it was there. But he said to me, you might have saved my life by sending me to Emerge, because he said it ended up being early stage cancer, lung cancer, stage 2. And normally lung cancer isn't diagnosed until stage 4 very frequently. It's not diagnosed till stage 4 when it's often incurable. So he felt very lucky that we had sort of incidentally found this. And the doctors felt pretty confident that they might be able to cure it with surgery. But during the testing of his tumor, it was discovered that he had a rarer form of non-small cell lung cancer called large cell lung cancer. Those terms are kind of confusing, but and his large cell lung cancer is about 1% to 2% of lung cancer patients. So not a lot of patients worldwide. And I've actually never met a single other person with large cell lung cancer yet in my journey. So they said, we're going to throw everything we can at it because there's no actual research particularly targeted at large cell lung cancer. So after his surgery, they successfully removed the tumor, and unfortunately, one of his lymph nodes came back as positive for cancer. So they wanted him to do chemotherapy, which he did. And he was going through chemotherapy sort of November to February, March period. And starting at about the end of November, he started to have a pain in his other rib. And, we mentioned it during appointments, and they, would check him to see if anything was growing there or wrong, and couldn't find anything. So everybody kind of assumed it was a pulled muscle again. But unfortunately, they do a CT scan after chemotherapy is finished, and during that, they discovered that the cancer had jumped to his spine. Only one vertebrae, which is a very small amount. A lot of times lung cancer patients get a spread in their brain or their liver, and sometimes their bones, but the liver and the brain are sort of the two most common places. So Michael only ever had cancer until the very, very end of his life in that one vertebrae of his spine. But because of where it was located, it was really, really painful because it was in his core. So every movement was painful. And so he was under palliative care for pain management for almost 2 years before he died, which is a really long time for most people. And they tried all kinds of things to deal with the pain. He had a really high pain tolerance because of some childhood trauma that he'd gone through, but it was excruciating, this pain. And it turned out that he was opioid resistant. Often the sort of standard types of treatments for pain and cancer are various types of opioids. And his body just didn't respond to any of them. So they were trying everything in their toolkit, and it just, nothing was helping. So a lot of the palliative doctors that we saw said, like, this is absolutely the worst case of pain I've ever had in my career, and I don't know what we can do to help him. So it was very, very difficult and frustrating and traumatic for his caregivers as well, his clinicians. And because of his pain, they kept trying to, they'd wean him off a bunch of drugs and try to put him on a bunch of different drugs. So in June of 2020, he was admitted to the hospital for that process again, and ended up on a fentanyl drip. So you know how strong that is. That's way, 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 way up there, as well as methadone, as well as a nerve pain drug. So, and it still barely touched the pain for him. And he had this very small part of, very, very small amount of cancer. So it was very difficult and sort of frustrating and bewildering to me about like why was this going to kill him, first of all? It's such a small amount of cancer in his body. And, you know, for the final year, they were like, we can't do anything about this. This is not curable. And I was like, but he's got such a small amount. Like, what's going to kill him? It was bizarre and strange and a really weird presentation of lung cancer, I think. Anyway, so he ended up in the hospital in June, and then he never went home. He became paralyzed within about 3 weeks. I unfortunately was at home with a very severe case of COVID. So I couldn't see him for 15 days, which was excruciating when he was in the final months of his life. And during that time when I was home, he lost function below his ribs. So when I came back, he couldn't move anymore below his ribs, which was really challenging. And that was really the only day that he said to me, I don't know how long I can do this for. He never said that again. He totally changed his attitude the next day and just was like, okay, this is the way it is now. I just have to cope with it. So he was very resilient in terms of his attitude, much more resilient than I was. I was kind of falling apart on the way home. I learned how to drive and sob at the same time. It was about 20 minutes from the hospital home to our house, and I got very good at that. And so he ended up in the hospital, as I said, paralyzed, and he died in late October of 2022. So I'm about 2.5 years out from that and still feel pretty new in terms of grief and widowhood and all that stuff. So I'm motivated by the things we went through to impact positively in the lung cancer space, in the trauma-informed cancer care space because of his background, and obviously in caregiver support because we're such a huge population and, you know, we need a lot more support and awareness for caregivers of all kinds.
Wow, that's a really touching story, Christine. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can imagine it's probably quite difficult. It's still fresh. It's only been 2.5 years. But here you are telling your story, advocating for that community, and you're doing an amazing job. I've read up so much on what you've done. I've checked out your website. You're doing incredible. You're doing great things, and I'm sure you're making Michael absolutely proud right now. So thank you for being here. So I'd like to move on now to reflecting on your journey in advocacy. Christine, your personal story with cancer is deeply moving and obviously very complex. Looking back, what have been some of the most meaningful moments in your journey from caregiver to advocate?
I started deciding to be an advocate about, I think it was within the first year. You know, grief is really forever. And I knew that going in. I'm very lucky to have a very close friend who works in grief and bereavement. So she was very supportive throughout this past few years. And I'm also an information person. So I had read everything I possibly could about end of life and grief and bereavement and cancer. And so I kind of knew intellectually what to expect, but you know, that's different than what you actually feel going through it. And there was so much happening and so much sort of traumatic stuff happening during his cancer. I mean, I don't think there's any nice cancer, but he had a particularly difficult journey in certain ways. And so, I wanted to make a positive difference where I could potentially with that after he died and once I became a little bit more verbal again. So, I think the gaps in care that we experienced or things where we thought, if we didn't know this, how would we know to ask these questions? How would we know what people to look for? So we had advantages because of my background, sort of medicine adjacent. And my sister was actually a VP of the healthcare center hospital that we were at. So we had connections and people, and we weren't intimidated by the systems. And we really wanted to impact that in a positive way, possibly for other people, and just raise awareness about lung cancer in general. When I think about what are the focuses of my advocacy, I'm trying to help people learn things they didn't know before, and maybe care about things that hasn't impacted them directly.
Absolutely, and you're certainly teaching me. And I had Katie Hewlin on here for episode 2, and her as well, because there's little that I knew about lung cancer, and you find out truly how it really affects people. And one thing that really stood out to me about that conversation with Katie was the day that she found out she had cancer, and having to tell her fiance at the time, that's tough, that's challenging. So I can only imagine how difficult that was for Michael to have to tell you. Michael's story shows the intersections of trauma, rural health, and cancer care. How have these realities shaped your advocacy work?
So I think when I was thinking about where I wanted to contribute, I'd love to cure cancer, but I don't think I have the capability of that. Most of us don't. And cancer is a huge topic. And I've always been someone who's interested in kind of the underdog and the issues that don't get a lot of visibility. And so I really wanted to talk about and write about our experiences with Michael's childhood trauma and how that impacted his cancer journey in various ways. Rurally, there are big gaps in terms of equity of healthcare in general, but certainly if you don't live near a large cancer center, we were lucky to live near a large cancer center, but, I still had to drive, half an hour or so to get there. And so there are people who don't have that capability. And also screening wise, one of the struggles we're having around preventing lung cancer or getting lung cancer at an earlier stage diagnosis instead of when it's mostly incurable is we need wider screening, and rural areas are a challenge for that. We're a big country, and trying to make sure people have access to that is challenging. So I think, all of those issues are something that I wanted to try and contribute to in some sort of positive way. So I work with the local Cancer Patient and Family Advisory Council. So everybody should know that if you have a local hospital and sometimes even a family medicine clinic, they're often patient advisors who are family members or supporters or patients, and they are giving voice to what those systems are like for them and trying to make sure they're included in decisions and policies and those kinds of things. So I do that locally. And then I also work in a similar capacity with Cancer Care Ontario now. And I did a presentation at the Hospice Palliative Care Association conference just last week, actually, and talk to people about our lived experience with hospice and end-of-life care and having previous trauma in Michael's history and how that kind of intersected and impacted things. So I'm trying to bring those threads together and work on some of those issues in a way that contributes positively.
You've dedicated yourself to raising awareness about lung cancer, which is often stigmatized and underfunded. What keeps you motivated in this challenging work?
Like I said, I'm a kind of an underdog person, so root for the underdog. And I feel like lung cancer, I didn't know things about lung cancer prior to Michael getting it. My grandfather actually died of lung cancer in the early 90s. And what I knew about it was if you smoke, you get lung cancer potentially, so don't smoke. And I totally agree with that still. Also, if you get lung cancer, you're likely going to die pretty quickly. And unfortunately, that is changing for the positive. My grandfather, didn't have a lot of options. And nowadays, I think there's a lot of amazing things. Even in the last 5 years, great improvements in lung cancer care and other kinds of cancer care too. But the treatments have become much more positive. And I'm really excited, like at Better Breathing Week, for example, to meet cancer patients who are 8, 10, 11, 12 years out from their diagnosis of lung cancer. Like, that's just amazing. And that wasn't possible 20 years ago. So I think that is really incredible. I think also, frankly, rage and astonishment propels me forward because I didn't realize that lung cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in Canada and actually most of the world. And it kills by far the most cancer patients every year. So almost a quarter of cancer patients every year die of lung cancer. And I don't think most people know that. Otherwise, why is it so underfunded and stigmatized? I think those are things that people just don't understand or don't realize is a reality. And younger people are getting it more and more. Women are getting it. Never smokers are getting it. So I think those are things that motivate me to kind of keep going and try and keep improving the public awareness part of things and also the research funding part of it. So I'm in the process right now of creating a tiny student scholarship for people who are studying lung cancer as graduate students, to try and, contribute in a tiny way to scholarship around lung cancer, because it is so underfunded relative to its prevalence in the cancer world. So yeah.
I totally understand the frustration with asthma care as well. It's underfunded. I mean, it's crazily underfunded. So I'm here kind of doing the same thing as you. Yeah. That's right. Absolutely. And that's why I stand by Lung Health Foundation and what they do, because it's not just, lung cancer that they're, helping to advocate and get funding for, and asthma and COPD and whatnot, but they're looking down, they're starting right from the start, right? They're looking at air pollution. They're looking at making policy change around global warming. Radon, exactly. They're covering it all, really. So that's why I agreed to speak at Better Breathing Week 2025, and why I hope to be there again in 2026. So thank you for what you're doing, Christine. And I'm glad we can kind of share that mutual, reasoning for being here and doing what we do. So I'd like to move on now to trauma-informed cancer care. You've developed workshops on trauma-informed care for cancer patients and providers. Can you explain why trauma awareness is so critical in oncology?
So I'll tell you in a little bit about my husband's sort of experience with this in his cancer journey. But when I was doing research about it, because I'm a person who likes to sort of try to take action when things aren't working well, I know that nearly 1 in 2 Canadians will get cancer in their lifetime. So that's a lot of people. And when I did research about trauma-informed healthcare, I found statistics from Census Canada and StatCan in 2018 that said that 29% of Canadian adults report being survivors of childhood sexual or physical abuse. And that startled me. I kind of thought that my husband was maybe a rare example, but he's not at all. And that doesn't count people who have been through some sort of trauma since childhood. So in a cancer center, it's a significant percentage of the population that are potentially impacted by previous trauma before they even get into cancer, which I think brings its own set of traumas sometimes for people. So, it's not insignificant. And the other thing that I discovered in the research was that people with previous trauma have later diagnosis for cancer because they sometimes don't want to go and get checked for things. They have lower rates of treatment compliance, and they have worse outcomes. So, it's not even just a factor of being kind or nice to patients. It's really actually has an impact on their health. Also, people who have previous trauma histories, especially if they have a significant number of different traumas, there's something called adverse childhood experiences. It's a scale that's used, and there's a bunch of different factors that if children are exposed to these things in childhood, it impacts their future health. And if you have more than 6 adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're called, you have a 290% increased rate of cancer, which is huge. So again, in a cancer center, you're likely dealing with people frequently who have previous trauma. So that it became really important for me to help clinicians understand this, because it's not just a rare person that's coming in with this history into cancer treatment.
Those are crazy statistics. I had no idea that there was a correlation between that. I had a difficult childhood. I lived in poor socioeconomic status as well, dealing with severe asthma and whatever was going on in sexual abuse. I mean, the list goes on. And it makes sense. And my medication compliance was not there at all. It should have been. I mean, my asthma could have been better controlled, but it wasn't really enforced on me either. We had other things to worry about. When it's crazy. I never really considered that, but thank you for sharing those statistics. How did your husband's childhood trauma affect his cancer treatment experience, and what lessons can clinicians take from that?
So the stories that I tell to clinicians when I'm talking to them, and actually, I'm very, very excited because we've just started a pilot project at the Kingston Health Sciences Center to do trauma-informed cancer care. And so I'll be speaking to medical radiation technologists and oncologists and nurses and a variety of groups of people. So I think that's a really positive step forward. And we're hoping that we can create a model that then can be scaled to other institutions as well. But the reason I feel like this is important, like the personal perspective that I have on it, is that Michael was raised in Northern Ontario. He was raised in very severe poverty. And his dad died when he was 7. And that left his mom with Michael, who was the oldest, and 5 younger siblings. So she had to get married right away because she didn't have a way of supporting all of those children and herself. And she came up from a family of 14. So her parents, tried to help where they could, but it was difficult. So she unfortunately married someone quickly, and it wasn't a great fit. And so Michael's stepfather was extremely abusive. And because Michael was the oldest, I think he was he tried to be the barrier between himself and his younger siblings. So he bore the brunt of a lot of that. And when he was 9.5, he was removed from the home because of the abuse, and was put into foster care, where he was abused again and more. So he kept running away from foster care because it just, it wasn't a great place to be. And in those days, you could be charged with truancy. It was as if you didn't go to school. He did go to school, but he was running away from foster care. So he got charged with truancy, and he got sentenced to a residential reform school, or what they called residential training school, near Ottawa. It's now very famous because it was rife with all kinds of horrific abuse. And so he was there kind of as a 10, 11-year-old, and remembers, bits and pieces of horrific stuff from that. And so it was sort of like abuse on abuse on abuse. And then when he was released, after he finished his sentence, he was released and told that his mother had too many children, so he shouldn't go back to her house at 11 years old. So he lived under a bridge in his village, a railway trestle bridge, for the entire winter, with a little sleeping bag that he found in the woods to keep him warm. So he was starving and freezing, and he wasn't even 13 years old yet. So he had this past experience that he'd worked really hard to change his life, to end up in a different place. And he'd been very successful. He joined the military. He wanted to help people, and he didn't end up back in a similar situation to where he'd grown, which I think was very meaningful to him. But he had all kinds of things he did daily to keep that history from impacting his daily life. So, for example, he had, and I hope this isn't difficult for people, but he had a choking and smothering history. And so he could not have anything near his neck. So he always wore a V-neck shirt. And so that's a simple thing, but it's something he could do to control his reaction to things, even, 40 years later. So he had all these things that he did, rules and strategies. And unfortunately, when cancer came along, some of those things weren't possible. So in his first cancer, which was very treatable, all good news, basically, other than you have cancer, the treatment for that cancer was 35 radiation treatments under a mask. And what they do is they build a mask so that you don't move on the table when the beam is being aimed at your tumor, so that it doesn't hit other parts of you. And for head and neck cancer, the mask goes from your head down to here, to your sort of, just over your shoulders. And it's molded to your face, and it's then bolted to the table so that you don't move. And it's very, very tight over your face. So the day that he had the mask, he knew this was coming. He was not looking forward to it. But the day that the mask was made for him, they used this kind of cloth that was malleable, and then it would harden to his face. And he had shorthanded his trauma history to the staff by saying he was claustrophobic. And that was pretty common for people. I think it's quite common for people getting head and neck radiation because there is this mask, and lots of people are claustrophobic with it. But he hadn't told them the real story. He just said, I'm claustrophobic. And so during the building of the mask, the staff were very kind. I think they tried to distract him by talking and talking and talking and talking the whole time during the building. And he came out of that session, said goodbye, seemed normal to them. I walked with him to the car, and he was literally shaking, holding my hand. And he didn't speak for 4 hours after that appointment. all he said was, I am not doing that. I don't care. I'm not doing that. And so he would have refused treatment if we hadn't worked together to figure that out. And he would have walked away from the cancer center and no one would have ever known that that's what happened, because he looked fine to the outside world and to the clinicians. So he was going to refuse treatment for a very curable cancer. So we had to figure out, how do we deal with this? He's got to do this 35 times. We've got to figure this out. And so what we ended up doing, he said, if it wasn't for you, I would run away to Northern Ontario and never come back and just not do cancer treatment at all. But I convinced him. We talked to the clinicians behind closed doors, and we didn't have to give them any details. We just said, he's a childhood abuse survivor. Here's what we need from you. And he said to me, when I was a child and I was in these horrific situations, I would fly away in my mind. I would go out of my body and I would fly away over the rooftops. I loved flying. It was my favorite thing to do. And I would always do that. And he said, because this woman was talking and talking and talking to me, I couldn't get into that headspace. And so we said to them, please don't talk to him. As soon as he comes into the examination room, don't say anything. Don't say anything through the test. Don't say anything at the end. That's what he needs in order to do this. And then after the test, after the treatment, he would go into the washroom immediately, wash his face and neck and sort of compose himself, and then come out to the waiting room. I mean, it was still horrific every one of the 35 days for him. It was awful. And it was awful for me because I couldn't tell people. There's this extra layer. They're like, oh, it's great that it's a curable cancer. And I'm like, but there's this horrible extra thing that I can't tell you about that made it really, really difficult. So that was a huge motivator. And then when, of course, having institutional trauma, as he did from a residential reform school, being in the hospital for the last 4.5 months of his life was really, really difficult. Having people come in the middle of the night and touch him for vitals and medicine, all normal things in a hospital, but really, really difficult for him to go through. So I feel like it's a really important element of the journey that he went through and the things I'm trying to improve for other patients going forward.
Everybody's situation's a little bit different. And what really stands out to me is how you said earlier that Michael, in his selfless way, said that no matter how I feel, somebody is worse off than I am. And I find that just incredibly modest to say, especially in that situation.
One of his expressions, he used to write little notes all the time and poems and things. And one of the things he said was, life has sometimes dealt me some lousy cards, but I always ended up with a pretty good hand. And that was very emblematic of who he was. He could always find the glimmers of positive, which not toxic positivity, but just could, was grateful for the things that he had that were good.
It's a great outlook. So I'd like to move on now to lung cancer awareness and challenges. Lung cancer remains the leading cause of cancer deaths, but receives less research funding, as you mentioned earlier, and public attention than other cancers. What are some misconceptions that you encounter?
I think the first question that so many people asked, which I think is a really rude question, when they found out it was lung cancer, was, did he smoke? And I feel like that's a rude question because you don't ask other kinds of cancer patients that question, or, that you don't blame them for their cancer. So Michael was a smoker a long time ago. And there are lots of sociological reasons why he was a smoker, I think, given his history. But he had quit almost 20 years prior to his diagnosis. And I have never smoked. And there are lots of people who get lung cancer who've never smoked, and lots of people who smoke and don't get lung cancer. So it's not a direct tie-in. Definitely don't smoke. It's not good for your lungs. But I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. I certainly thought before I was connected to lung cancer, I thought, okay, if you don't smoke, you're not going to get lung cancer. And that's not the case. So that's the biggest thing, I think. And I think the other thing is, because of that stigma, I think there's a sort of overarching sense that, well, we don't really need to donate to this because it's their own fault if they get this. And so I feel like that's part of the reason why it might be underfunded slightly, given how prevalent it actually is. So I really want to try and help raise awareness about those things that people aren't informed about. They just don't know that there are people like Katie, for example, who've never smoked, who are in her 30s, who get lung cancer. And that's more and more common. So that's astonishing to the people that I tell. And I think that's telling. We really need to still keep working on those messages.
No, you're right. And we had Jessica Buckley on for episode 12 as well, so CEO of Lung Health Foundation. And she said essentially the same thing. I mean, we see increased amount of people that are never smokers being diagnosed with lung cancer, yet the stigma is still there. What improvements would you like to see in lung cancer screening, funding, and support across Canada?
So certainly one of the frustrations for me is that we have breast cancer screening, super important. We have colorectal screening, super important. We have cervical cancer screening. But the cancer that kills the most people doesn't have screening widespread across Canada at all. And I think that needs to change, and it is starting to change. But it's still, it's difficult because right now the way you screen is with a low dose CT scan, and not every location has that. So if you're in a northern Alberta town, you're not going to have access to a CT scan. So things like liquid biopsies, which are now coming into more into play in the next couple of years, which are where you do a blood test that tells you about certain cancers. I think they give me a lot of hope that will help with wider spread screening. It'll be cheaper. It'll be accessible to everyone in a way that having a CT scan is just not. But, even in my local cancer center, that the lung cancer screening program has had to be deferred until this coming year because there are other difficult projects that they're working on. And so that screening is still not in place 4 years after my husband died, which I think we need to move faster on these things, if at all possible, because screening, if 70% of patients with lung cancer don't get diagnosed until stage 4, we can greatly impact the number of people dying from it if we get that screening in sooner. Michael was a rare example. A lot of the people that I met at Better Breathing Week were astonished that he was diagnosed at stage 2 and he was already dead because, they're all stage 4 diagnosis and they're doing well. So I think it's unusual. And the idea is that the earlier you're diagnosed, as long as you don't have large cell lung cancer, the more likely you are to survive for a long time, which is great news and really important.
So I'd like to move on now to supporting caregivers and those grieving. Caregivers often feel invisible and overwhelmed. What do you think are the biggest gaps in support for caregivers during and after a loved one's illness?
Yeah, I feel a little bit funny advocating for caregivers because I really have one intensive caregiver experience under my belt. My dad was also diagnosed with cancer 6 weeks after my husband died, but my mom was the primary caregiver there, and I was kind of helping out with my sister. So, but I think that my experience has been that, caregivers need a place to put their feelings, because one of the things that we experienced, Michael and I, was that I didn't want to tell him things that worried me because I didn't want to make him worry about me more. When he was asked by the doctors all the way through his illness, what are your goals of care? Like, what are the things that are important to you? He would always say to stay as long as possible with Christine and make sure she's okay. So I didn't want to tell him things that I was struggling with and make it harder for him to leave, or make it harder for him to feel him feel responsible for my feelings. So I think caregivers need a place to share those. And cancer centers do have social workers, but they're very, very overworked. And so those supplies, those things are limited. The caregiver associations provincially have some supports, online webinars and videos and things that you can download, and groups that you can join to meet other people in similar situations. Likewise for grief, there's a lot of resources, and actually grief.ca just launched in the last couple of weeks, and it has a lot of really good resources for people going through anticipatory grief and also grief after someone has passed away. So I think, support in terms of psychological and psychosocial support is important, and community, but also financial support, I mean, I think we were in a lucky situation that, as I said, I didn't have to worry about working and bringing in money and looking after children. So, as Michael said, we were very fortunate in lots of ways. But that's not the case for most caregivers. They're raising children, they're working, they're doing all sorts of things. They're driving big distances. They're losing work and money because of their caregiving activities. So I think financially, there's some stuff that needs to happen to help caregivers in those ways. There is a government program now where caregivers can get a 6-month, like an employment insurance benefit if their person is imminently dying. But there are lots of caregivers for whom that's not the case. They're a long-term caregiver. So I think the financial support is also really important for people.
I can attest to that. I grew up in Nova Scotia. My mom was a single mother of 4 kids at home in an old house. I was in the hospital 3 months out of the year with severe asthma. And I mean, I had my other siblings at home while I was in a warm bed. I had my mom with me. Even though she had to support the rest of my siblings, she was there with me. I was there in a warm bed. I had warm food. My brothers and sister back home, they had nothing. They didn't have a heated house in the winter time. We barely had food. I deal with a lot of that emotional stress today because realizing how I took their mother away from them, really. And I mean, the tough part is my mom did an amazing job. She was such a great caregiver, and you would never guess that anything could be wrong on her end. She was just always so positive. When I moved from Nova Scotia at the age of 18, I left for college. I learned what my triggers were. I mean, I still obviously have severe asthma, but I learned how to mitigate and manage those triggers. And then I learned that my mom, I knew she had asthma. My mom has severe asthma. And I would be in the hospital myself struggling to breathe, and my mom could be there struggling to breathe, and you would never know it because I came first to her. And that's challenging. Her needs came second. And I think that caregivers need to be given so much more attention and help, psychological help, emotional help. I mean, really, they 100% deserve it because they're going through so much. And in the unfortunate circumstance that you lose your loved one, as you did, well, you're still here. You still have to deal with that emotional distress. So I can imagine that's incredibly challenging for you.
Yeah, and I think some people lose their sense of identity. It sounds weird, but if you're looking after someone for a long period of time, it becomes your whole world in a way. And then when they're gone, it's like, well, now what? Because the focus of your day becomes very different. And so I know that a lot of caregivers, especially spousal caregivers, sometimes struggle with that.
Your Widow Tantrums and Caregiver Confessions workshop is unique in its honesty and community building. What inspired you to create this, and what do participants gain?
I think I was thinking about it because I'm quite active on social media. Before Michael died, I was active in the cancer space, and then since he's died, I've been active in the mostly spousal loss space, although somewhat grief as well. And I found incredible community there. It's the best part of social media, really. It's, people are amazingly supportive. And I feel like that's something that more caregivers need. And also just a place where they can say the real things. It's kind of ugly sometimes, the things that you think. I was jealous. I was really, really jealous of other people with cancer. Because they could, they were like, oh, we're going to Ireland because he's only got a year left. We're going to do this life bucket list trip. And I was like, we can't even go around the block in the car because it's way too painful. So, and it feels awful to be jealous of people who are also sick. But, this is the kind of place, a workshop like this is a place where people can talk about those things and talk about the struggles that they're having. It's also very challenging for me, and I know for others, to be CEO of everything now. Like if something, my husband especially was extremely handy, so I'm not used to having to hire people for things or solve problems myself that are around machinery or, and there's been a few times I wanted to lie down in my driveway and just have an absolute temper tantrum because I can't fix the hose or I can't get the light bulb changed in my headlight. And, he's not there to do that. And so that is feels unreasonable and feels childish, but I know that it's a real feeling and it's a feeling for other people who've lost their spouses as well. So I wanted to just create a place where they can have that space to feel those things and express them.
How can friends, families, and healthcare providers better support caregivers navigating grief?
So this is not unique to me, but it certainly worked for us. And that is, I think people don't know what to do. They don't know what to say, but they want to help. And what they default to is, let us know if we can help. And that's actually not helpful when you're in the throes of an illness or a grief. You don't have the capacity in your brain to figure out what they should do to help you. So what I suggest to people is, if you can say something concrete, that's useful. So things like, I had friends, for example, who would say, I've dropped groceries, they're on your porch. My family was incredible with practical things. So they would say, we're going to come over. We were moving out of our big property into a smaller property for me after Michael was going to be gone. And so he was very ill during that. And so they would say things like, we're going to come over. We're going to close your pool for the winter. We're going to bring lunch, and we're going to bring chainsaws. So we're going to get that pile of wood taken care of. And they just said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z because you've said it would be helpful. And I didn't have to think up the list of things for them to do. They just said, we'll come and do it. And so it was incredibly helpful when I was just like, it felt like I had a traumatic brain injury. I couldn't process things very well. And I feel like I'm just kind of starting to come out of that now a little bit more. But yeah, so I think, and just also offering to listen and to talk about the person. So, the person who's died, it's like they just disappear all of a sudden and nobody wants to talk about them. And that's incredibly painful because as their person, the only thing you want to do is talk about them. I had a friend whose spouse died about a year ago, and I said to him, do you want to come over or I'll go to your house? And he came over to my house and we literally talked about our spouses for 8 hours. That's all we did. Because you just don't get that opportunity. It's like they've just disappeared and people just don't want to speak about them. So I think it's because people think it's going to be painful. And sure, it's painful, but it's more painful to just have them never spoken about again. So I think I would encourage everybody to say their name and talk about them and, come up with a memory. Remember last Thanksgiving when they said this or did this? Those are just so precious when you're grieving.
Great advice, and I totally understand it. You need that outlet because you're thinking about them 24/7. You want to speak to somebody about them. Their memory should live on. It shouldn't just end there. I'd like to move on now to personal reflections and moving forward. You've been a career advisor, author, and now a passionate advocate. How have these different roles shaped your perspective on life and purpose?
I think what I decided after Michael died, or, a reasonable amount of time after Michael died, when I started to feel like I wanted to do some things, was that I had all these career skills. I've done over 3,000 presentations and I've written 2 books and I've been a columnist for magazines. And so I have these sort of a skill set that I felt like I could leverage in a way that would benefit the volunteer work that I was doing. So they all those things sort of came together to work and make me channel the kinds of work that I want to do now as a volunteer. All my workshops are free, so I don't charge people for them. I'm not trying to get a job. I'm not trying to build a business anymore. I'm really just trying to make differences for people. And so I and using those skills that I've had. I've always been someone who has worked to help people achieve goals. As a career counselor, I was talking to students every day about their life choices and where they wanted to go from here, and the degree decisions that they were making. So I think that the educational part of me needs a project still. And I'm just a project-based person. I'm not someone who gets my kicks from cleaning my house or, shopping for things. So I think projects where I'm educating people and making a difference, hopefully, are the things that really motivate me and help me get up in the morning on days when it's really hard to get up in the morning.
What advice would you offer to someone facing a similar caregiving journey or loss?
I think, first of all, be kind to yourself as much as you can. I certainly felt like I was often doing things wrong, or, and especially looking back, I think, oh, why didn't I do this? Or why didn't I do that? So I think that being kind to yourself is really, really important. And also, I had a lot of people who said to me while Michael was sick, are you doing things, are you taking care of yourself? And it was very well meant. But I remember thinking, I don't have time to take care of myself right now. My time with him is very, very limited and precious, and I'm not going to spend it going to a spa. That was a decision I just didn't want to make. I can understand why people think that that's important, and it is important. So I had to do things because I have a fainting disorder, for example. I had to do things like make sure I get enough sleep, make sure I was eating decently, so that I wasn't getting sick on top of Michael being sick. So those are kind of the self-care things that I managed to do. But I also want to say to caregivers, it's okay if you are kind of a mess while these things are happening, because it's really hard to balance all the things that are going on and also take care of yourself. And then the other thing is just to seek support. So whatever that looks like for you. So it might be that you have a person or people in your life that are really supportive and could just listen to you rant and rave and cry and rejoice when you get good news, all those things. It might also be someone professional, or a community-based. There are lots of community-based grief groups. There are lots of community-based loss groups for particular types of loss. So there's child loss groups, there are spousal loss groups, there are parent loss groups. So those are things that I think can be really helpful as well. And I joined those things, not necessarily because I needed help with the grief. I knew the grief was going to be terrible and it's ongoing. So I wasn't really upset that I was upset. I was just wanting to meet people that were maybe in a similar situation as I was, who would just get it. So if I suddenly canceled a date with them, they didn't need to know why, they just understood. And that's, I think, feeling understood in those situations is really important.
What are you most hopeful for in the future of cancer care and caregiver support?
Well, that's a big question. I think I hope there's more caregiver support, I guess, because I think most people are going to be a caregiver at some point in their lives. And so we do need to build in structures and supports for people doing those in a better way than we are currently. And also I hope that for cancer care, I'm really encouraged by how much action there is in the last couple of years around new treatments, targeted therapies for things that were a hopeless case, only 5 years ago. Those are just amazing advancements. So I hope that those things continue and expand for more and more patients. And I really hope for earlier detection for people so that there are more and more cancer survivors. There are already more and more cancer survivors, to the point where I'm seeing workshops for clinicians about what do we do with these people now that they're 25 years out or 20 years out and they still have some residual side effects, but they're alive. That wasn't a thing years ago. You didn't have to worry about long-term survival in a way with cancer patients, but now you do, which is wonderful. And I hope that continues.
It's a good problem to have. And I think in regards to the targeted therapy, Katie had said the same thing. She was a big advocate of targeted therapy. And just like to point out there that Katie Houlin's episode remains my top episode thus far on the podcast. So if any listeners here haven't listened to it yet, it's episode 2. I recommend giving it a listen.
Yeah, and one of the things she talks about is that targeted therapy isn't always funded, which is an important thing we need to improve too.
So now we'll move on to your final thoughts and plugs if you have any. Before we wrap up, Christine, is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners, perhaps upcoming projects, resources, books, or ways people can get involved?
So like I said, I'm a volunteer, so I don't charge for things. Other than if I travel somewhere, I just need to make sure it doesn't cost me money. So I ask for cost recovery for those things. But so one of the things I want to say is invite me. I'm free and I'll come and speak to your group if that's helpful to you. I have an article that's forthcoming in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which is a peer-reviewed journal that goes to mostly physicians, but lots of clinicians. And I'm really excited about that because that is about trauma-informed cancer care. And it's going to reach a really wide audience of clinicians who hopefully will learn some or get some awareness and also learn a couple of tips. I'm not a trauma expert, but I do have some concrete suggestions for clinicians that might be helpful. And the biggest one is just assume there's trauma. Treat it like wearing gloves when you draw blood. If you assume every patient has trauma, you're going to do better. And that's the whole person you're dealing with, which is really important. And then the lung cancer screening, I'm working with the Lung Health Foundation on talking to politicians with the tobacco settlement that's come down. We're wanting to make sure that the governments are using that money in a way that supports prevention programs and supporting people who are already impacted by tobacco and vaping and those kinds of things. So calling your politicians locally and asking them to spend that money wisely, I think is important as well. And joining our group, I guess, doing that.
That's a huge initiative coming from the Lung Health Foundation in regards to the tobacco cessation, which I spoke about with Jessica Buckley, and vaping as well. Youth vaping is an issue. Please check them out online, see how you can help. That is lunghealth.ca. And Christine, I believe your website is www.christinefader.com. And I'm going to put all that information in the show notes as well. Before we wrap up here, Christine, I have a single final question for you that I ask all of my guests that come on the episode. Whether you are living with a chronic illness, caring for someone who is, or simply part of a community that values hope and resilience, every breath we take is a gift, a reminder of our strength and our ability to keep moving forward. If you had only one last breath, but with it the power to influence the world, what would your message be?
So I'm going to steal from my husband in this moment, because he often said during his cancer illnesses that there's always hope. And he said this to me across the hospital bed one Tuesday late in October. And he was being asked whether he wanted to be taken to a different hospital for treatment if he got an infection. He said, yes, there's always hope. And it was the last time he said that to me because he died the very next morning. But I hold on to that. He never, ever gave up hope. And it wasn't toxic hope. It was just that he could hold on to the positive things and believe that there was hope for the future. And I think that's really important for everyone.
Christine, thank you so much for sharing your story, your insights, and tireless advocacy with us today. Your work shines a light on the realities of lung health, trauma, caregiving, offering hope and guidance to many. To our listeners, if you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, share it with others who might benefit, and leave a review. For more about Christine's work and resources on lung cancer and caregiver support, check the show notes. Until next time, keep pushing forward, keep breathing deep, and never let anything hold you back.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Weeds. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share. Follow us on Instagram at Beyond the Weeds, and or follow me at the Asthma Runner for more updates. Keep breathing strong, and remember, your potential has no limits. Until next time.